But I'd like to extend a welcome return to Dr. Todd Gray, MBE. He's presented here many times, covering a variety of very well-researched topics. Devon and the slave trade after our AGM in May last year, which was our first streamed event. Previously, he's spoken here for Lest Devon Forgets, for the Remembrance Day in 2021. And during the lockdown, we had a record number of log-ons of over 120 of our U3A members for an outstanding, fascinating, most informative presentation on the Cathedral Yard Farm. And in the chat, one of the members had written, "I'm watching from Spain, glad I didn't miss this talk." And I know that's what a lot of people think. And I have had quite a few apologies this morning from people who didn't want to come and sit in the audience because they're about to take a flight and didn't want to catch COVID. Some people are in New Zealand, other people are in Derbyshire. So lots of people have sent their apologies for this morning. Now, recently, as you may have seen on Spotlight, Todd has been busy in Barnstable following a recent discovery of a detailed map of Barnstable in the Bodleian Library, a 1650 map. And it's going to be on exhibition in the town's museum until the 18th of February, together with a new book edited by Todd. Now, here's hoping that Todd discovers an ancient map of Exmouth, Todd, do you think? That we didn't know existed. But today, though, something completely different from Todd, Christmas in Devon, an appropriate subject for those of us attending our U3A Christmas meal after this presentation. So please extend a very warm welcome for Dr. Todd Gray.
And thank you for turning up. I thought everybody would be at home listening to Harry and Meghan talk about truth. What a concept. Now, I don't do truth. I do what I can discover from the evidence. So this is about Christmas. We like to think Christmas is the same sort of thing happening year in and year out. But of course, Christmas changes and there are lots of different things added to it. It's not just a religious festival, it's this cultural event. And even the date was agreed on, I think in the 900s at Rome, when they got together and said, we've got to find a date and say, this is Christmas. Before then, we weren't convinced it was this date or that date. So there are lots of imponderables about Christmas, but the main thing is it changes, and it has to change according to keeping things alive. If any celebration just a year in, year out stays the same, it's going to die out. So you may know Exeter was famous for the gunpowder plot. In the 19th century, its celebrations on Bonfire Night were bigger than anywhere else in Devon, and it was said by Beatrix Potter that the rabble there were notorious. And it was said that we did it bigger than anywhere else. Well, I don't know if that was true, but what we had was a very organized event, lots of money by low church merchants who were fighting for the soul of the church in Exeter against the cathedral, which they saw was too high church. So we had 20,000 a year gathering in the cathedral close, burning in effigy, not just the bishop, but people they didn't like in Exeter. And it was different in the 19th century than it had been in the 18th, and it would be, of course, in the 20th century. And we tend to think it's the big event, but even Gunpowder Night was a political move. there had been Elizabeth's Day beforehand on the 17th of November. And we did the same thing. We had a bonfire, we rang the bells, there was dancing. And James I comes on the throne, and people are still celebrating his predecessor's day. It's like Rishi wanting to get rid of Liz Truss Day or Boris Day. And of course, that Guy Fawkes mask, that face, is the symbol of anarchists all across the world now. And you see that, and that is all about Guy Fawkes. So Japan, Australia, South America, it's become something different again, and only in the last 10 years. But the big difference is, of course, Bonfire Night is merged with Halloween. So if you're younger, you don't know the difference between the two, if in fact you know anything about the gunpowder plot. It would be interesting to know who here saw the last guy amongst us. I can't remember it for 20 years. It's probably not politically acceptable or socially acceptable now for some reason. But Christmas also has to change. I think this year we're seeing a big change in lights outdoors. There's a whole generation that thinks Christmas lights outside are traditional. But of course, they only come into England in the 1990s, I suppose, from America, where they had been going for years. We have been used to the Queen's annual speech at 3 o'clock. I'm assuming we'll still listen to Charles, but that was a feature now for 60 odd years. Christmas number 1. For some people, this is a key part of Christmas. The rest of us couldn't care less. And there's a whole generation that now thinks Black Friday is traditional. And depending on who you are, you have your own type of Christmas, because there's so many parts of it. A few years ago, the Dutch community who lived in Plymouth brought in Black Pete, the little black boy that accompanies St. Nicholas in Holland in their festivals. And it was very interesting seeing Black people in Plymouth saying it was racist, the Dutch people saying this is part of our cultural heritage. And whose culture do you support? Who's right in this? Well, now in Holland, they don't do Black Pete. So I think Plymouth has stopped doing Black Pete, but it was traditional for a long time. So what I thought we'd do is look at some of the things in Devon which have marked out what we've done here, similar to other parts of the country, but some of which aren't. And one of them is a hogner, H-O-G-N-E-R. And these were figures that went around house to house, usually farmhouses or small settlements, particularly at Christmas. They would sing, they would dance, they'd be given drink and food and raise money for the church. And they are a particularly West Country thing, particularly well recorded for Devon. So Chatford, Exbourne, Mullen, Ashburn, Ashbury, all places spread out across Devon. And quite early on, we've got into the 1560s, we've got a nice little note, 1607 and 1630. They die out later on, and they're replaced by church ales as a way of earning money. But there's something else alongside them. But what we need to do is think of an event like this. It's a bit of frivolity. But as Devon goes Puritan in the later 1500s, they fit uneasily into the society which is now thinking we don't dance in public, we don't sing, and we certainly don't drink to excess or canoodle, if you see what I mean. Now, I just thought we'd look at some examples from the earlier period. I put this as Elizabethan, but this one isn't. I hope you can see this. This is above a door at Bishop's Tainton in the church on the south side, and it's better than the stonework, better than the photograph I can take, because this was done in the 19th century and there's been a lot of damage since. And I think what we're looking at are the three kings, and then that's Mary on the right. And I think they've knocked out the baby Jesus, or it's collapsed. And this isn't Elizabethan, this is Norman. So we're looking at nearly 1,000 years. And for other images, we race up into the early 1500s, and this is a bit of stained glass at Heartland, probably put in the early 1900s, because this would have been destroyed if it was in an English church in the 1500s. But this is probably continental. And you can see the angels behind, there's shepherds on the right, there's Joseph, there's Mary, there's a few animals, and then there's Jesus there, and what's a European type of a crib. Now, this is another image. We have carved wood, 1600s, and same sort of thing. There's the shepherds, there's baby Jesus, you can just see him down below, Mary, possibly Joseph on the right. If he's not, no, he must be on the right because he can't be the one on the left. This was put in Plymtree Church by a high church vicar. And some of the things he put into that church were so high he had to take them out. But this would have been destroyed in England in the 1500s to 1600s, but he snuck it back in the Victorian period. This is original, and it's always been there. It's one of three churches on the screen, the screen which separates the nave from the chancel, going across the breadth of the church. And you can see the same thing. Here we have the three kings with their gifts. This is probably about 1510, maybe 1520, could be a bit earlier. And then there's Jesus, not as a baby, but more as an infant. Now we have several of these, 3 altogether. This one has been damaged. You can see the face has been defaced in the middle, and then on the left, and then again Mary on the far left. And the king on the right is black. Here we are again. Mary again as a blonde. 3 kings, right one is dark. And then damage again done deliberately, I would say, to Mary. In Crediton, we have this carving of about 1500, maybe a bit earlier. And there's a limited theme in subjects, but there are angels there. The 2 animals, the angels all spread out, and then what looks like a manger on the right. Cornwall is slightly different in that we have a king and a camel. Nothing else around it, and I'm assuming there were a whole series of bench ends with this on it. And this is one of the ones that survived, whereas the other 6 or 7 were probably destroyed. Now, when we go into the 17th century, we have more images, and we have to note that in the 1650s, Christmas was downgraded. It was meant to be illegal to have a big family do. You didn't have a celebration. The Puritans felt that the way the Church of England had celebrated Christmas was profane, that it was a perversion of the event, and that we shouldn't make it into a great celebration. We should just mark it as any other day. But we do have, before they came into power, certain things. This is Stir Up Sunday in 1940. On that Sunday, when you mix all the ingredients for the Christmas pudding, and we have that in our accounts in the 1600s. Not called that, but there are 4 accounts one for Newton Abbot, another just west of Tavistock, one at Barnstable, and another in East Devon at Payhembury in a house called Lay Hill. And the one at Newton Abbot, which was for Lady Lucy Raynal, who's this woman here, she left an account book, and her ingredients come down from Bristol, and there are prunes and dates and figs, all dried, along with all the spices, you know, the cinnamon, the ginger, the nutmegs, all that's together. And she has it 6 weeks before in order, I think, to do her Christmas food. And I'm suspecting that that's for Stir Up Sunday. But the house at East Devon, we have a wonderful series of accounts for them. And one of them is an account for the 12 people who came for Christmas lunch in, I think, 1604 or so. And you see William Water and his wife, John Salter and his wife, Prowse and his wife, Baker and his wife, Alice and her daughter, and then William, widow Bourne, and John Water, the last one, making 12 for lunch. And what's nice about this, and this is extremely rare to have, we've got a list of everybody who came over the Christmas period. And what they are key individuals and the manors that the family owned in Gittisham and Fennerton and Seaton, all around East Devon. And this is one of the only indications we have of the celebration of Christmas at that time. And it's almost every day for 2 weeks, that list. Now for West Devon, their household account gives us something we don't have anywhere else. And what we're looking at is these are items with how much they're being paying for them. And the top bit is the date. So there's mutton, lamb, veal, neat's tongues, 7 marrow bones, 4 partridges, 2 cocks and a partridge, 2 dozen and 1 cock. There's malt, oatmeal, 10 chickens, 6 bottles of wine, which came from Launson. And then there's claret, sack, 800 oysters, 400 apples, 5 chickens, a rabbit, 400 more oysters, 10 more chickens, 9 more chickens, and 12 eggs. So that's a meal for Christmas or Christmas food during that week, but they're bringing in food the previous week, and it's whole sides of venison, whole mutton, whole cows, being everything one by one being brought in, an enormous amount of food. Now, this is during Cromwell's period, and Cromwell does make it illegal for this to happen, but we do have a visitor to Devon who says the only part of England that's still celebrating it in the old-fashioned way are on Devon farms. Now, he may have been not a good observer, but it's interesting he says that. So for the early 1600s, we have this depiction, which is related to Holcombe Rogus in East Devon. And I think this is 1630 or so. In Barnstable, we have this wonderful ceiling. 4, let's see, here, there, and there are 4 religious scenes set with animals. So one of them is the Nativity. And it's sort of the main story. Oddly enough, the man that did this did another one in a house nearby. That house was pulled down in 1910. It was then, the ceiling was taken out and transported 60 miles away to another house and erected in an extension. And we've got the same depiction there. And what we have in both ceilings are these animals set all around it. So they are mythological, exotic, or everyday British animals. So they could be farm animals or wild ones like foxes. And I think what it does is it shows the piety of the owner in the 4 religious scenes, but the animals are meant on the one hand just to be bewildering because there's so many of them, but also to delight you. I think they're meant to make you feel and look happy when you look at them. Now, also in Barnstable, because Barnstable is famous for plasterwork, we have this one 19th century photograph of an overmantel with a knight on either side, and in the middle is the nativity scene. So there are the shepherds coming to see the family. The bit on the right, the knight on the right, and then the knight on the left was sold separately. We think the middle bit was destroyed. An antique dealer sold the bit on the right. This was 100 years ago that it was demolished. But the man on the right, the knight, was sold a few years ago to a man in Dorset, and he used that photograph to have a completely new version installed in his home. So there's the old one on the right, and then here, there's Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and then the shepherds. Rather extraordinary, I think, that he did that. At Exminster Church, which I think is 1630s as well, we have what very rare for Devon, a plaster ceiling, an ornate one, and depicted in there again is a little nativity scene with the 2 animals, Joseph, Mary, and then Jesus with an enormous print. Now, I don't have much for the 18th century that's of interest, but in the Victorian period, we start to have an awful lot. And there are parts of the Victorian celebration which are virtually gone. One of them, of course, is the Boxing Day hunt. You know, a big feature of Christmas for the countryside all the way through to what, the 60s or 70s. And then now we pretend it didn't happen. In Devon, from the middle part of the 1800s, the Boxing Day swim. So that it's now traditional, but you know, it's new. Now, we didn't go in for Christmas trees and for ivy and holly in the way as other places, and particularly mistletoe, but we did have kissing rings and kissing bows in which we put bits of gorse and whatever we had, and this is one from the early 1900s. We did do the same as everybody else with Christmas cards, which I wonder if this is a key year in Christmas cards, because so many people are giving up now because of the cost. And it may be this is the turn, and in 10 years' time, Christmas cards may have gone. And you know, we'll miss the joyfulness of writing out cards. So if you look at the Victorian ones and the Edwardian ones, they are very different. One of the big themes was local images. Here, of course, is Exeter. And then I just found this one at Barnstable. And last year I came across this in a collection of documents, geese going off to be slaughtered for Christmas. Happy Christmas. Oh, we're going for a ride. And then this one, which I have no idea what date it is, but not all elements of this you could do today. Now, Christmas trees in Devon as elsewhere start off more as charity. We know that some of the early Georges had Christmas trees at the court in London, so early 1700s, but everybody knows that it's Albert that makes it more popular. But what you find is a tree is used at, say, Star-Crossed Children's Home. And the big treat, of course, is a new pair of gloves or socks. And children thought how lucky they were to have a new pair of gloves. Try that now. But they start off as charity and develop more into homes. Another feature of Christmas in the Victorian period, of course, were the Christmas stories. And what you would have from the Victorian period, 1860s onwards, local writers would set a ghost story or a love story in Exmouth. And it would be published in the Christmas issue of the Exmouth Journal. And, you know, we've got descriptions of grandfather reading out the story to all the family on Christmas Day. I did these as little tiny little books a few years ago, Dartmoor, romance, Exeter, ghost stories. The ghost stories are frightening, you know, it turns out it's a goat. Or, you know, there was somebody tapping on the window, it wasn't dead grandmother. But some of them are very inventive. And that was a feature of Christmas all the way through, I think, up to the Second World War, and then it stops. Now, this is the feature which you see all across England, and we have more of in Devon than perhaps other places because we're lacking in glass beforehand. Our Anglican churches are full of Victorian depictions of Jesus, and some of them quite remarkable. This is one at home, and it's a scene again of the kings coming along to see Jesus, and what is remarkable are the faces. The man that did this used models in London, so he got interesting faces to depict in his glass. He was known for going out and finding people that fit what he thought he needed to portray. So I find him really quite captivating, I have to admit. That whole glass means more. And you look around and then you realize in some windows, the person that paid for the glass is actually in the glass themselves. In Exeter, it's the mayor of Exeter who was there at the birth of Jesus. We're the only city in the country to have a mayor there 2,000 years ago. Now, some things, of course, come in later on, and some of our churches, like Tiverton, have an 18th century painting, which was brought in the 19th century when it was considered too idolatrous. But they are beautiful pieces of work. But there's something wrong with what we understand as a Christmas in Devon, and a Christmas as being traditional. And I've noticed lately people have been writing or putting on television that Dickens invented Christmas. Well, this is what is said in the 1800s. And there's one writer in the 1870s who comments, and he said, you know, all this stuff that Dickens is writing, we didn't have when we were children. We had a very different Christmas. Now, if you go through the records, this is one of the things that we do see. The fat shows. Now, I think this painting was probably destroyed. But this is what they comment on in the 1820s, 1830s onwards, is how much meat, how good our farmers are in producing the best meat ever, which you can see on sale in the butcher shops or in the markets in Exeter. And that gets across in a painting what they say in their words, but that's not exactly the same as Dickens' portrayal of these huge, great meals. Now, there are aspects of it which are true, and one of them is something Devon was particularly fond of, and that was the ashen faggot. Ash, of course, burns when it's green. And we're not a county where we have lots of wood. So what we would do is we would take the ash and bind them together. And this is a better image there, with a withy, you know, with willow. And you put it into a bigger house, a farmhouse or a manor house, And that would be put on the fire and it would serve for a Yule log. So you would light it and you have company over, and the tradition was every time a withy burst into flame and it broke, you'd have a drink. And that is still going on in some pubs now, but it dies out in the 19th century when people stopped going to the gentry house for other things. Now, the reason why they were going to the gentry house is partly because of mummers. And there are different traditions of mummers. These are the descendants of the mummers from Devon who are now in Newfoundland. And they still do this in a big way, much bigger than we do. But they're more disguised. We're slightly different. This is an image I got from, which happened, I took this from the net, in front of the cathedral a few years ago. You can see St. George, then there's the dragon, there's an antagonist who's often a Turkish knight, there's Father Christmas, and after the sword fight, there's a doctor who mends the people who get hurt. And one of the earliest, if not the earliest recorded mummers plays is Silverton, 1738. If you read it in a Devon accent, it makes sense. So I slew the dragon and brought him to the slaughter. And by that very means, I married Sabra, the beautiful king of Egypt's daughter. It's done for that purpose, I think. Now, what happens from the 18th century to the 19th century is you start to see different heroes and different villains. So you would have Napoleon as the villain and maybe Duke of Wellington as the hero, Churchill and Hitler. I can't do anybody, Mr. Trump and virtually anybody going, I suppose. Trying to think of one. But, you know, often it's politicians or figures that you would have. The head of FIFA, say, who I don't think is loved. And that does alter it. But what you're doing with these mummers plays is you're going from farmhouse to farmhouse. You're dressed in exotic type clothing. It could be all white with ribbons like Moristatz's. But there was a penchant in the 19th century for going and getting granny's clothes. So you would have great big brassieres and underclothes and dress as a woman because that's funny if you're a 17-year-old lad. It's the same thing now with rugby boys liking to dress up in women's clothing. You know, it's one of the favorite things for them to do. It's always been that way because it's a laugh, it's funny. And when you're 17, nobody's done it before. And these kind of plays get adapted. You go and you play for, and amuse people with the singing, with the play, usually to raise a bit of money for charity or just for the drink. And this happens all over Devon, and then it starts to die out when something else takes over. And it's partly pantomime. When we have a hall, particularly a village hall, that you can do a pantomime in, there's no need for a mummer. And the earliest I have for Exeter is Miss Fairy Dewdrop in 1876. And of course, this is a bit like Top of the Pops and Hot Gossip. Because Hot Gossip wasn't for the 18-year-olds, it was for the dads to watch. Mom's got nothing to watch, but I think Miss Fairy Dewdrop is for the dads who were bringing the children in to see the pantomime, because you saw a lot more than you would in Victorian England. But in between pantomime and our mummers, you have something else going on. And that's the minstrels. We start off, it's interestingly, before 1860 with white men blacked up singing what they called plantation songs. There's a other slightly unacceptable name for them. But then we start to have real American blacks coming over, usually post-American Civil War, who are wearing their slave clothes and singing songs they allegedly sang as slaves. But in Devon, they were so popular, and of course we keep running with this until relatively recently, they're so popular, there aren't enough Black people around to sing. So we really take on blackface. Virtually every parish you can find minstrel singers, local people singing. Until, what, 75, 76? It was on television? Something like that. Alongside that, there's the other thing which takes over from the mummers is English folk songs. And of course, the most famous folk song of all for Devon is Widdicombe Fair, Uncle Tom Cobley. And that and other English folk songs are captured by Sabine Baring-Gould in 1883. So from 1883 all the way through into the Second World War, folk songs become commonly sung at Christmas in particular. And this is everywhere in Devon. So we have that entertainment side, but there's a slightly darker thing going on as well. And that's mumping. Now, I don't know if anybody knows what a mumper is. Is it any recognition to the word a mumper? Well, you don't want to be called a mumper. A mumper is a beggar. And what we have is a tradition which carries on all through the country under different names. So what we do is a few days before Christmas, we beg under different names, going a gooding, doling day, a corning, sawing, mumping, or a Thomasing, because it took place on St. Thomas Day. And it can be for money, but in Yorkshire it's particularly for food ingredients, grain, grain also in the Midlands, bread, candles in Lincolnshire, Devon. And the way it's done, and particularly in Devon, is really counter to this idea of Dickens. What you do, if you're poor, you appear at a door in your rags, your absolute rags. You wear the worst, dirtiest clothing, the clothes which are full of holes. You appear at a gentry door and you ask for money or food, on the pretext that you don't have a day's income on Christmas when you can't work, and it pays for your children's Christmas lunch. Now, we know in in Crediton, certain houses have the gentleman of the household sitting in the hall with his guests behind him, and then the poor people come along and he gives them a penny when they show up. And everybody else is in their finery, drinking a glass of bubbly and watching this procession of poor people coming in. It's a way of giving charity. But we have some poor people saying how demeaning it was to have to beg for my children. And a man in Kingsbridge says it was appalling. And he's writing of the 1830s. And he said all the poor people in this place had to be grateful to the wealthy for those few pennies or a bit of bread, a bit of meat, whatever it was that they were given. And he was writing in the 1860s, and he's saying, here we are in Dickens, and we're being told of the good old days. He said the good old days were rotten. We had no money. He says, but look at us now. He says, we have homes with a toilet and a kitchen. And my bedroom is separate from my children's bedroom. And I can cook my own meal in my own kitchen. I don't have to have a bakehouse to have that cooked. I don't have to go to the Lord of the Manor and ask for a few pennies. Society in the 1860s, he says, is much fairer than it's ever been. And we should stop be thinking of the good old days and be thinking of what people have fought for us to have today. It's a really extraordinary account. And what he's looking at is this sense of entitlement and the difference between the wealthy and the poor. Now, I did that book 20 years ago. And when I did this in the early 2000s, people were pretty prosperous then. And it was interesting how different that same lecture was greeted under austerity, when things were tightened up a little bit more. And then now again, when we have food banks, we suddenly realize all those years of prosperity and how easily we go out for a coffee, we go out for lunch, we go out for a meal. When you think in the 50s and the 60s, that was a treat. When you think if you don't have the money, you don't buy things. You don't put it on credit. You don't put it on your credit card for another time. Those values shifted so much. I remember people laughing at an older generation of having a pork dinner and putting a little piece of pork and a couple of potatoes and a tin in the kitchen. Why do you put those leftovers in the kitchen? I remember people saying. Now, of course, this is good house economy because we don't have the money again. And perhaps thinking about mumping teaches us being careful with money isn't a luxury. It's what we have to do. We always should do it in good times and bad. And when people say, you hear on television, I didn't know interest rates could go up. And you think, well, it's been so long, people have forgotten what it's like. And children this year are going to have a lot less in Christmas than they had a few years ago. But they're not entitled to it. And this generation in this room will remember getting a lot less and perhaps being a lot happier with what you did have than the enormous things which are thrown away 6 months later. And this is, I think, one of the things about Christmas. It's changed according to how prosperous we are. And if anything, maybe this year we're going to look back at what we did have and how people have less and learn to be happy with what you have than unhappy with what you think you deserve. And maybe that's what Christmas is all about. All right, thank you very much. I should say for Christmas, the perfect gift for Christmas is a book. And the best present for a wife or a husband is a book on strumpets or how to swear. But I've done some art books, Art of the Garden, bench ends, and then we talked about St. Martin's Island, the cathedral church, so the cathedral buildings that burnt down. That's my big map book on Exeter. Cloth discovery. And then last year we looked at, or earlier in the year, we looked at slave owners, slave trade, and the new book on Barnstable, which if you're a Barnstable person is great. And this, I just wanted to point out, I did thinking of what's happening today. The Queen came to Exeter 11 times. And in each time, she was greeted with lots of enthusiasm. And as she got older, I think we all appreciated her more, thinking, God, how much longer can you keep doing this? And when she died, that sense of loss, but also that respect she had, which we haven't had for a king or queen for a long time because she was 60 odd years. And I wanted to mark that, thinking what happens next isn't going to be like with the Queen. And today with Harry and Meghan, I think is the start of a change and perhaps a pulling down of some of that. And what Charles gets as respect may not be what the Queen had. And I just wanted to mark in a little booklet what it was like this year, before any of this stuff happens from now on. Because I think the next few years are going to be very different for the monarchy than the Queen had. You had to be pretty brave to sit there and insult the Queen. But I think Charles is going to get it constantly from now on. So this was a marker in time, if that makes sense. Right, okay.
Thank you, Todd. Living history, I think. Todd, have you got any UFOs? No, I don't think he will have. Unfinished objects. What I like about Todd is that he gets things finished. I mean, all those books, that's absolutely remarkable and so important for us all historically, because he's gone through all this research, looked through all these original documents, read some of the difficult to read writing, which is quite an achievement in itself, made all those notes, documented it, and then, fantastically, got it into a book. And so he hasn't got any UFOs. So well done for that, Todd. And always humorous. That's what I like about Todd's talks. Very popular because they are humorous. He makes some serious subjects quite amusing, which is difficult, so that's an achievement in itself. And he brings in so many things that we perhaps haven't heard about, like mumping. I wondered whether you were making that one up, actually, until you've given us the evidence for it on the screen. I thought it was fantastic, and all those different traditions just for Devon, which is really special for us, with us living in the county. And for somebody who's not native here, Todd, that's brilliant, because you do so much. I mean, you live here all the time now. I've got to be careful, haven't I, what I say? But really, really good. Absolutely fantastic. So well done, Todd. Excellent again, as usual. So thank you very much. Thank you.